The phrase lost generation was first used to refer to a specific group of American writers and intellectuals who were disillusioned by the devastation caused by the war and came of age during or shortly after World War I. This group, which included authors and thinkers like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway, exhibited a deep sense of confusion and mistrust towards the institutions and ideals that had sparked the conflict. They were viewed as lost because they felt alienated from the social mores and institutions of the day, which they believed had been tarnished by the atrocities of the war. But the term's meaning has developed beyond its original meaning. The term lost generation has evolved over time to refer to a number of groups that, frequently as a result of distinct crises or periods of transition, share a common sense of dislocation and aimlessness. This is the development of the term's meaning. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and let me know what you think about this video on the comment section. Now, let's delve into today's discussion. The concept of lost generation was first used to refer to a particular cohort of American writers and intellectuals who had been severely impacted by World War I. Their feelings of hopelessness and disappointment came to represent more general changes in post-war culture. Clear-cut ideas of right and wrong were challenged by the brutal realities of trench warfare and the atrocities of contemporary fighting. Those who survived the conflict experienced existential doubt and moral dilemma as a result of the senseless slaughter. Veterans of the front lines frequently suffered from psychological and physical wounds. They became disconnected from mainstream American society and felt aimless as a result of their dissatisfaction with societal structures and ideals. This disappointment even led to a rejection of conventional wisdom and standards. The effects of the war caused many people to doubt and frequently reject the social norms that had been in place before to the fighting. One of Ernest Hemingway's books is titled The Sun Also Rises. Hemingway's book, which was first published in 1926, is a shining example of the writing produced by the lost generation. A group of foreigners dealing with feelings of detachment and aimlessness are portrayed in the novel. Hemingway's straightforward, spare writing style reflects the existential conflicts of the characters as well as the general sense of pessimism of the time. Hemingway's writing frequently addresses themes of alienation and the quest for purpose in a broken society, which reflects the larger sense of dislocation experienced by the lost generation. Fitzgerald's work from 1925 is an indictment of the 1920s materialism and moral decline. The narrative effectively conveys the disillusionment of the lost generation with society values by highlighting the shallow nature of the American dream and the moral emptiness that lies under its surface. Fitzgerald's depiction of the Jazz Age exposes the hollowness that lay behind the hedonistic chase of wealth and pleasure during the time. His characters struggle with the disappointment of living in a culture that is fixated on excess and status. Many writers and artists belonging to the lost generation adopted modernism as a response to their disillusionment. Modernism is typified by experimental approaches including fragmented narratives, stream of consciousness, and symbolic imagery. The intricacies and uncertainties of their day were intended to be reflected in these advances. Themes of alienation, fragmentation, and the pursuit of meaning in an increasingly chaotic world were commonly explored in modernist art. The apparent shortcomings of conventional forms and ideals prompted this artistic exploration. A large number of the lost generation resided in communities of expatriates, especially in Paris, which developed into a center of creative and literary endeavors. Collaboration and communication between authors, artists, and intellectuals were encouraged in these societies. The innovations and criticisms of the lost generation shaped modern literary and creative traditions and had a long-lasting effect on American culture and literature, inspiring later authors and artists. The skepticism of the lost generation also included criticism of society expectations and conventions. Many of their works questioned the viability of pre-war goals and questioned conventional ideas of morality, success, and identity. Following their disappointment, there was a quest for real human experience and authenticity. In the midst of a shallow and fractured society, the literature and art of the lost generation frequently centered on discovering true connection and significance. A lasting impact has been left by the lost generation's investigation of existential concerns and their defiance of conventional ideals. Their writings are still relevant today because they provide understanding of the human condition and the challenges of surviving in a world that is changing quickly. The legacy of World War I had a profound influence on the lost generation of the 1920s. Their disenchantment was evident in their writing and artwork, which was marked by a rejection of conventional wisdom and a search for authenticity in a broken society. Their contributions to modernist literature and their cultural criticisms have influenced American literary traditions and culture for a long time. Once applied only to the disillusioned authors and intellectuals of the 1920s, the phrase "lost generation" was expanded to refer to a new generation of young people experiencing different issues after World War II. Born into an economy that was booming and relatively peaceful in the late 1940s and early 1950s, this generation of post-war youth quickly discovered that the world they lived in was dominated by geopolitical tensions and conflicts. There was a generalized sense of fear and uncertainty throughout the Cold War, which was characterized by fierce rivalry between the US and the USSR. This was made worse by the growing Vietnam War, which became the center of controversy on a national and international scale, and the Korean War 1950 to 1953, a major but frequently underreported conflict. Particularly during the Vietnam War, extensive media coverage revealed the brutal reality of warfare and sparked a great deal of public discussion. The Vietnam War began to represent larger social and political disenchantment as it carried on. After being originally inspired by post-war optimism, a large number of young Americans started to doubt the principles and reasons behind us involvement in foreign wars. The literature and culture of the era reflected this growing skepticism. The Beat generation, which first gained notoriety in the late 1950s, developed into a potent voice that captured the anxiety and discontent of the time. The disillusionment felt by many of their colleagues was conveyed by writers such as Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. Their art frequently criticized the materialism and conformity of the 1950s consumer society. The poems On the Road by Jack Kerouac and Howl by Allen Ginsberg expressed a strong sense of isolation and a desire for more meaningful relationships. This generation's criticism of the status quo, its emphasis on materialism, its inflexible social mores, and its apparent lack of authenticity illustrated their quest for individual and group identity. The Beat's emphasis on exploration, individuality, and spontaneity was a response to a society they perceived as fake and constrictive. In a society that was changing quickly, their writing and way of life represented a larger search for authenticity and a better understanding of oneself. Historical developments and cultural changes interacted in a complicated way to shape the lost generation that followed World War II. The Beat generation's defiance of social norms and quest for a more authentic human experience is an example of how the optimism of the early post-war years gave way to a more complex and critical view of society. Social attitudes and action underwent a dramatic change in the 1960s and 1970s, broadening the concept of the lost generation. This phrase originally described people who were demoralized by the aftermath of World War I, but in this instance, it refers to a new generation that is coping with its own problems. Significant social movements arose during this period. Movement for civil rights fought for equal rights for African Americans, challenging deeply rooted racial stereotypes and fighting against racial discrimination and segregation. The feminist movement promoted gender parity by tackling topics including discrimination in the workplace, women's rights, and reproductive rights. Protests against war. These demonstrations, which were mostly focused on opposition to the Vietnam War, denounced the government's foreign policy and military activities, expressing a wider mistrust of authority figures and establishments. The Vietnam War had a particularly significant impact on the mentality of this generation. The contentious nature of the war and the high death toll made many wonder about the government's intentions and the purpose of the fight, which exacerbated feelings of mistrust and disappointment. Concurrently, countercultural movements such as the hippie movement surfaced, endorsing unconventional ways of living and principles that markedly diverged from the norms of mainstream society. This includes innovative art that defied conventions and new genres of music like psychedelic rock. The counterculture promoted peace, love, and individual independence while attempting to investigate alternative lifestyles. In general, the time was characterized by a search for purpose and transformation, propelled by a feeling of being lost amidst swiftly changing social and political environments. The 1980s witnessed a shift towards neoliberalism, which was marked by deregulation reducing government restrictions on businesses, privatization selling state-owned enterprises to private entities, and an emphasis on individual responsibility and free market principles. The 1980s saw a significant shift in economic and cultural paradigms. An era of prosperity for some was facilitated by these policies, which were linked to tax reductions and economic expansion. Even if the 1980s economic boom raised many people's standards of living and created riches, it also made social and economic inequality worse. People who did not profit from these developments frequently felt excluded and alienated as the emphasis on material prosperity and personal achievement increased. Neoliberalism took hold in the 1980s, characterized by privatization selling state-owned companies to private companies, deregulation lowering government regulations on industry, and a focus on personal accountability and free market principles. There was a dramatic change in cultural and economic paradigms in the 1980s. These measures, which were associated with lower taxes and increased economic growth, helped bring about a period of affluence for individuals. The economic boom of the 1980s increased wealth and improved living conditions for many, but it also exacerbated social and economic inequality. As the emphasis on material prosperity and personal achievement intensified, people who did not benefit from these advancements often felt left out and alienated. The global economy is becoming more integrated, which has opened up new avenues for trade and cultural exchange, but it has also brought about new kinds of instability and exacerbated economic inequality. This has impacted many people, particularly the younger generations who could feel negatively impacted by shifts in the employment market and the state of the world economy. Young people have been severely hit by the economic downturn brought on by the 2008 financial crisis and the sluggish recovery that followed. Many people have difficulty obtaining steady employment, finding cheap housing, and reaching conventional goals like becoming homeowners. This economic precarity fits with the idea of the lost generation and adds to a feeling of disenfranchisement. Social media and digital technology have revolutionized how people interact and communicate. Although modern technologies give people new avenues for communication and self-expression, they can also cause feelings of loneliness and disarray. Anxiety about not measuring up to expectations and feeling alone can be made worse by the temptation to show an edited, perfected version of oneself online. Participating in a lost generation might have significant psychological ramifications. Anxiety, despair, and a feeling of disillusionment might result from the interaction between social media influences with economic difficulties. A feeling of inadequacy and despair can be exacerbated by the failure to meet conventional success indicators and the continual comparison to idealized online identities. Due to the combined effects of globalization, economic instability, and the ubiquitous influence of digital technology, the current lost generation has a distinct combination of problems that mold their experiences and sense of self. Being a child at a period of fast change, unstable economic conditions, and social unrest can cause deep-seated disenchantment. People may experience a lack of direction as the conventional routes to prosperity and security grow more elusive or ambiguous. A number of mental health conditions, including, can be accompanied by this feeling of disappointment and insecurity. Persistent concern about one's personal stability, job security, and future. Depressing, gloomy, and disinterested feelings in once enjoyed activities. A profound sense of meaninglessness and introspection about one's role and position in the universe. Many people in this situation devote a great deal of attention to discovering their own identity and significance. A lack of direction in society can cause existential crises, in which individuals find it difficult to comprehend their role and meaning in a world that is changing quickly. These mental health issues are frequently conveyed through culture and the arts. People may express their existential anxiety and feelings of alienation through artistic endeavors in an effort to make sense of their experiences and establish connections with like-minded people. Their disenchantment becomes a means of coping and making sense of it through artistic and cultural expressions. Being a member of a lost generation has psychological effects that include existential and deep emotional issues that are influenced by the larger environment of social and economic instability and are frequently addressed through artistic mediums. Sociologically speaking, belonging to a lost generation can have a big impact on views and social behaviors. Members of a lost generation frequently develop a broad mistrust of established institutions and authoritative figures as a result of their disappointment and fragmentation. This mistrust may result from the institution's alleged inability to resolve or lessen the political, social, and economic problems that the generation is facing. Activism and political disengagement. This mistrust might take many different forms. If people believe their issues are not being sufficiently heard or represented, they may become disengaged from traditional political procedures. Others might actively participate in social movements that oppose the status quo and push for reform. Social justice, environmental sustainability, and economic inequity are common topics of this activity. Members of the lost generation may look for alternative lifestyles that more closely fit their goals and beliefs when they feel alienated from mainstream values. This can entail choosing unconventional job routes, living in cooperative housing, or engaging in other cultural customs. The lost generation's overriding legacy frequently entails a vigorous campaign for reform and increased social fairness. Their struggles and experiences of alienation can serve as a catalyst for addressing structural problems and advancing the creation of a society that is more inclusive and egalitarian. Being a member of a lost generation has sociological ramifications, such as a critical attitude towards established institutions, a desire for transformative change aimed at achieving more social fairness and equity, and a variety of political and social activist expressions. The lost generation has left behind a rich and diverse cultural legacy. The lost generation produced important works of art and literature, especially those from the 1920s. Works by authors like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Jack Kerouac addressed themes of existential agony, disillusionment, and the quest for meaning in a world that was changing quickly. Their profound subjects and inventive approaches have made a lasting impression on modern literature and art. Themes like disenchantment with societal standards, identity disintegration, and existential inquiry that were common in the works of these earlier lost generations are still relevant in contemporary society. These topics serve as a framework for current conversations on the meaning of life in complex contexts, the influence of societal change, and individual and community identity. The lost generation's creative and literary works provide insightful analyses of contemporary existential issues. They continue to inspire new generations in their own journeys for understanding and expression, and they offer a framework for comprehending how people and society struggle with change, meaning, and identity. The legacy of the generation that was lost emphasizes how critical it is to solve the difficulties that various groups face. It emphasizes the necessity of continuing to consider the state of humanity and work towards establishing a society that is more inclusive and equal. Studying the contributions and experiences of the lost generation gives us a new perspective on how to address current problems and promote societal progress. The lost generation's cultural heritage, in its whole, is proof of the art and literature's continuing ability to reflect and impact society ideals and issues. It is a source of inspiration as well as a historical reference for dealing with present and future issues. As we continue to negotiate the challenges of the 21st century, the idea of the lost generation is still pertinent. The historical, cultural, and economic circumstances of each lost generation iteration have influenced its members, but the fundamental themes of separation, existential doubt, and the pursuit of meaning have not changed. Examining the lost generation in its widest and most expressive definition helps us understand the difficulties that many cohorts have experienced over time. With this knowledge, we can address the problems that lead to hopelessness and disappointment and endeavor to build a society that is more inclusive and equal. The lost generation's legacy is proof of the fortitude and inventiveness of people who overcame great adversity and tried to make sense of what happened to them. The lessons learned from the lost generation can help us confront the problems of our day and build a more optimistic and interconnected world as we turn to the future. I hope to have you join me on the next video. Turn on your notification by hitting the bell below. Like, share, comment, and also subscribe to this channel.